We are equally proud to say that this representation is also evident among the speakers. Of the 233 speaker roles that we have, 60% are women representing varied stakeholders. We've put together 40 sessions, 60 plus hours of content over 4 days to explore the new challenges and approaches to business and human rights in Asia and the Pacific. The opening plenary has 2 sections. We will play a video message by the UN leadership of the co-organizing agencies, followed by a facilitated multi-stakeholder discussion with Professor Surya Deva and me as the moderators. At the end, there will be an opportunity for question and answers. Please note that this session is live and also live stream on rbhrforum.com. So, to kick off the UN Virtual Responsible Business and Human Rights Forum, we would like to play the video message from all the co-organizers UN agencies.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of all organizers, let me welcome all of you to the UN Virtual Forum on Responsible Business and Human Rights in Asia Pacific. The forum provides an opportunity to promote business respect for human rights in line with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights in both normal times and during a crisis like COVID-19.
The pandemic has magnified existing inequalities and vulnerabilities, with major impacts on the region's sustainable development prospects. The urgency of overcoming the health and economic crisis risks diverting attention from climate change and environmental pollution. As the Asia-Pacific region works to build back better, we need to ensure policies and stimulus programs prioritize people and the planet.
COVID-19 could drive 500 million people into poverty by the end of 2020, widening inequalities and reversing many of the gains made in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Yet, if the policymakers and investors, the scientists and activists, the innovators and administrators all join forces to stop the reversal and push forward, we have reason to hope. Today, many companies are aware that human rights is their business and is better for business too. They know that by respecting human rights, they are investing in a brighter future for people, for economies, and for more peaceful and inclusive societies.
This pandemic has laid bare the extraordinary inequalities and injustices of our world of work. It has shown how vulnerable millions of working people are in times of crisis. Now, we have before us the task of building a better normal, building a future of work that no longer allows injustice or inequality.
Women are hit harder in this crisis as they face the triple burden of vulnerable employment, more unpaid care duties, and household violence from lockdowns. Together with widening inequalities, jobless migrant workers, and millions more at risk of leaving the workforce, this could unravel meaningful gains in the Asia-Pacific. To build back together a more equal society, our recovery must be gender responsive.
With more than 325 million children in East Asia-Pacific not able to attend school for a prolonged period of time, we are compromising our future. Our future leaders are at risk. We cannot return to business as usual. To recover, rebound, reimagine requires concerted action from governments, all kinds of partners, UN agencies, business leaders, communities, and others. Together we can stop COVID-19 becoming a lasting crisis for children.
Let us turn this crisis into an opportunity
and build back better.
Let us act collectively
to develop these pathways that must be different,
to create an equal,
inclusive,
and sustainable world.
Let us work together.
Hello, everyone. My name is Surya Dev. I am a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. I represent Asia Pacific in the working group. And it's my great pleasure to co-moderate this very distinguished panel of experts from UN agencies and other stakeholders for this UN Virtual Forum on Responsible Business and Human Rights. Let me quickly introduce all the panelists in one go, and then the moderators are going to pose questions to the different panelists in 2 rounds. In the first round, we will ask the panelists to identify the major impact, the challenges of COVID-19 pandemic on the world in all aspects. And then in the second round, we will be asking the panelists to respond in terms of recommendations, the solutions, what should be happening in future. So we have today Mr. Kavya Jeti, who is Deputy Executive Secretary, UNESCAP. We have Ms. Valerie Cliff, and she is a Deputy Assistant Administrator and Deputy Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific UNDP. Ms. Shamini Darshni Kalimuthu, she is Executive Director of Forum Asia. Then we have Ms. Panuda Bonpala, she is a Deputy Regional Director, Office for Asia and the Pacific, ILO. We have Mr. Rajiv Dubey, he is the Principal Advisor, Mahindra & Mahindra, and also Chairman of Mahindra Insurance Brokers. We have Ms. Sharon Bureau, she's the General Secretary of International Trade Union Confederation, ITUC. We have Ms. Sarah Nibs, she's a Deputy Regional Director, UN Women Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. We have Mr. Marco Corsi, he is the Deputy Regional Director for East Asia and the Pacific Regional Office for UNICEF. And last but not least, we have Mr. Gam Shimri, and he is the Secretary General for Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact. So with this very quick introduction, so that we save time for substantive interventions, let me start asking questions to different panelists. And Kavya, if I may start with you first. My question is, as you know, that the pandemic has had severe social economic impact on society. So can you share some thoughts about this, that how it has impacted the Asia Pacific region? Kavya, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. Of course, first and foremost are the health impacts. We all read the newspapers. We all know what that situation is, a huge amount of devastation. And this is still evolving with surges, second waves in countries in our region, from Indonesia to Iran. Second, of course, are the impacts on people's lives, on people's livelihoods, especially the massive job losses. Informal workers, women, older persons, persons with disabilities have all been disproportionately impacted. And it's likely that the temporary workers, the migrants and their families will also experience large losses of incomes as remittances fall by anywhere between 20 and 30%. And this is important because in a region where 60% of people have no access to social protection and 40% of people have no access to healthcare, the effects are likely to be greater inequality and higher levels of poverty. Thirdly, and linked with this, are of course the economic impacts. The shock to both demand side and supply side of the economy, including the very fragile supply chains that have been exposed, is expected to lead to a decline in GDP, possibly 4 to 6%, possibly even more. But the economic impacts are not equal, are not the same across all sectors. Let me highlight that the micro, medium, small enterprises that really are the backbone of many of the economies of our region, including here in Thailand, these are the hardest hit. And at the same time, they lack the means and the financial resources to keep paying the rents, to keep paying their workers, and to keep paying other costs during the lockdown that we are still experiencing. And many of these businesses also operate in sectors that are most hit. For example, international travel and tourism. This sector generated about 10% of our region's GDP in 2019. So countries where tourism was important and plays an important role for economic development are going to be severely affected, including the small island developing states. But the impacts of COVID have also helped to underline where investment now needs to be directed. And we heard that at the opening. Clearly, social protection is the most important tool for building and rebuilding resilience to pandemics and disasters. And our levels of social spending are low in this region. So just taking them up to the global average is going to be vital. Secondly, technology and ICT. Again, this has been shown to be a necessity, vital for e-commerce, for e-schooling, for e-meetings, for e-government, but there is a digital divide. So an investment in technology and ICT so that everybody has access. And then third is the building back better that we heard during the opening. And this much of that should revolve around decarbonizing of the economies. So those really are some of the early indications of the socioeconomic impacts of this pandemic.
Thank you very much, Kavya. Now I would like to move to Valerie. Valerie, COVID-19 has also raised serious doubts about the realization of Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. So how can businesses ensure through responsible business practices that the achievement made toward the SDGs so far are not undone by the pandemic? You have the floor.
Surya and fellow panelists, thank you very much. Over 500 million people could be pushed globally into poverty due to the economic crisis resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic, according to recent estimates. The Asian Development Bank estimates that global employment is expected to decline by between 158 million to 242 million jobs, with Asia and the Pacific comprising 70% of total employment losses. An estimated 1.3 billion people in the informal workforce in Asia and the Pacific are anticipated, of course, to be hit the hardest. These numbers indicate that inequalities already felt deeply in our region will continue to widen, with marginalized and vulnerable populations experiencing the most hardships. As we move toward recovering from the pandemic, UNDP is leading a UN-wide effort on socioeconomic recovery with an aim to build back better or build forward better in partnership with UN agencies and governments. Beyond immediate needs, UNDP encourages a recovery response that steers towards more sustainable development trajectories. I want to emphasize the centrality of a human rights-based approach in our determination towards building back better. As noted by UN Secretary General, the COVID-19 pandemic started as a public health emergency, evolved into a socio and economic crisis, and is fast becoming a human rights crisis. Many companies have already rose to the occasion, preparing hotels for medical use, switching manufacturing to masks and PPE, and donating to important public responses. Businesses also need to move beyond corporate social responsibility to ensure that human rights are respected in their labor force and are promoted, and avoid any negative impact on the rights of their consumers and in the communities where they operate. In March, UNDP and Asia Pacific published Human Rights, Due Diligence, and COVID-19, a rapid self-assessment for businesses to provide companies with an initial guidance to help them assess their human rights impacts. We're hoping that the tool will also be useful as a checklist of expectations governments can set for companies during the pandemic. We're very conscious of the difference UNDP can make with our partners through the resources made available by the government of Sweden and the European Union to promote compliance with business and human rights standards in the region. We've repurposed a large part of our program specifically to support COVID-19 related actions of governments and business entities. We're working in 11 countries, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Mongolia, India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, with ministries, business associations, and civil society to ensure that the recovery work is guided by the principle of leaving no one behind. Thank you, Surya.
Thank you, Valerie. I would like to now bring a civil society perspective to this table of discussion about COVID and its impact on society. So Shamini, if you can address this question about how COVID-19 pandemic has impacted civil society, civic space, because some governments and some businesses see this as an opportunity to undermine the freedoms available for CSOs and human rights defenders. So how can civil society networks work together to ensure that the economic recovery is not built on irresponsible business conduct? You have the floor, Shamini.
Thank you, Surya. We have seen repressive laws impeding the enjoyment of fundamental rights and freedoms proliferating across the region. A latest example comes from the Philippines, where the Duterte administration has fast-tracked an anti-terrorism bill that will institutionalize and facilitate abuse of power at a time when the country is grappling with a public health emergency. Also in the Philippines, mining operations are still allowed to continue despite lockdown measures, combined with harassment and red tagging of communities opposing the operations. Governments are passing laws that give bigger concessions to businesses with fewer environmental obligations, like in Indonesia with the passage of a mining bill in May, and in India, where proposed environmental guidelines give way for ease of doing business. In this context, it is vital for us, civil society organizations across Asia Pacific, to break our own silos. Irresponsible business conduct affects a myriad of indivisible and interdependent rights. Our work should equally draw in interdependence and indivisibility, from civil and political rights and the rights of migrant workers to the right to a safe and healthy environment. It is equally important to highlight best practices we have come across to demonstrate that the change we desire is achievable. In connecting our work, we need to ensure that the demands, the collection of testimonies, and cases from local and grassroots communities and organizations are brought to the national, regional, and international fora. These cases are lived experiences, and these help entrench two key messages. That firstly, there can be no economic recovery if the powerful, including businesses, cannot be held accountable. And secondly, that the space for civil society will continue to shrink and dissenting voices will be silenced if we do not push back. Thank you, Surya.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shamini. Over to Harpreet.
Thank you, Surya. Hi, Panuda. In the video, ILO's regional director said the pandemic has highlighted the precariousness of work. What are some of the dimensions of such precarious work that stand out, especially the impact of vulnerable workers? The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning to all. You have heard that billions of workers are in precarious working conditions. They are more vulnerable in many dimensions, from catching the virus to lack of access to health, to sudden loss of jobs and income. And for many of them, basically, there's a lack of livelihoods. One of the most important group that we should pay attention to is the impact on those in the informal economy. A number of speakers have mentioned them earlier, but let me repeat that globally, almost 1.6 billion workers in the informal economy are significantly impacted by the pandemic and also during the lockdown. And more than half are in the Asia Pacific region. About 988 million are in our region. So that is pretty large number of workers in precarious conditions that we have to really think about. The ILO estimates that the loss of earnings among the informal economy workers have declined in the first month of the crisis alone by 60%. So this means clearly that many of them fall back to working poverty. And for informal workers economy in Asian Pacific region, it is estimated that their loss of income would be decreased from 22% to 36%. So clearly, this is important group that we have to pay attention to. And of course, for Asia Pacific region, one important dimension of the economy is a global supply chains. is important for jobs and employment for many workers and important for the economy in many countries. In many sectors such as automotive, electronics, agriculture, garments, their production in the global supply chains have been disrupted, and clearly these have affected millions of direct and indirect jobs, and particularly at the lower tiers of the supply chains. Another important group, migrant workers, this has been mentioned earlier, but let me just add that the impact on female migrant workers are quite significant. And already they have been in the informal, unprotected work, and you have heard many of their stories come up in the media recently. They are the first to be laid off the job, and very often many of them have to return to their home countries. Another important group, of course, the part-time workers. Many of them are women also, and they also work under short-term contracts arrangement, some in the digital gig economy, and often they are not eligible for unemployment benefit or income support. And clearly, they also are pushed into much more difficult situation. In many countries, we know that the older workers, they are already in difficult situation in normal times. And clearly, during the pandemic, they also have the burden of health risk, why it's very difficult for them also to maintain and sustain their job. So these are some of the most critical dimensions of the vulnerable groups of workers. There are more, but with time constraints, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think in here, it's important to bring in also the business perspective. And I would like to invite Rajiv to respond to these questions. Rajiv, businesses are facing a range of unprecedented challenges because of COVID-19, much like the governments, much like all of us. How do you think businesses can strike a balance in ensuring that businesses survive and that they also act in conformity with the responsibility to respect human rights? The floor is yours.
Thank you. So you're right that there are a range of problems and they are centered around cash for survival. How do we deal with people? Because ultimately people are the source of competitive advantage and survival. And their engagement is vital for innovation and productivity. How do we deal with the supply chain? And finally, how does leadership behave? Now, if we know that it's not either or, we have to address both the people side of things and we have to address the pure sort of cash kind of things. So while businesses have to relate to immediate survival and the realities of survival, we need to be all the time very mindful that we give hope to our stakeholders and we deal with empathy, because business finally is all about trust. And we believe that trust is based on truth and transparency. And the way to achieve that is by respecting human rights, by having a lot of dialogue, by talking, by trying to co-create the solutions and not forcing people into a win-lose situation. So ultimately, it is about knowing that we are in it together. One side cannot win if the other side loses. We have to find win-win solutions. And at the core of that is human rights and making sure that workers and people are engaged so that they can be productive and they can be innovative. And the balancing between the short and the longer term is the critical thing that we are all struggling with.
Thanks, Rajiv. Sharon, what should be the key learnings from the states and the businesses from the current COVID-19 crisis?
Well, good morning and thank you. First of all, let me say that this COVID-19 will be forever known as the pandemic that stopped the world. And it's exposed starkly the fault lines, the fragility of our world that already existed because we had a convergence of crisis. We had historic levels of inequality, income, of course, but also inequality for women and racial inequality. We had a climate crisis creating devastation in its wake from extreme weather events and risking the very future of human civilization itself. And of course, we have to face the fact that progress for women had stalled on every indicator. and that young people were already at risk of being lost in terms of secure and decent work. The technology divide, as was said, is stark now with the digital divide, but equally we still face choices about the best and worst of technology. You then add COVID-19, and indeed it started as a health crisis. It's now a social and economic crisis, but it's also, as Valerie said, a human rights crisis. As you see the divides between business, those businesses we all work with that want to actually change the future and look to human rights, to due diligence, to the dialogue, as Rajiv said, that will build a future that is not just in recovery, but is also building resilience. And then there's the employers that, frankly, we are horrified by, who've simply even taken government money and simply laid off workers. And of course, we have a divide in government. We have those governments who've done everything they can to support their people and business. But we also have governments who've used this, and in the Asia Pacific, the human rights abuses in India, in the Philippines, in many countries, is really horrifying for all of us. I don't understand how governments can see that you can't that you can actually survive in the future if you don't put people and planet on an even keel. Now, of course, we're very frightened because you have potentially 300 million jobs that may be lost in full-time equivalent hours. 1.6 billion of our brothers and sisters in the informal economy are still already facing destitution. We simply see that social protection was totally inadequate. 70% of the world's people do not have social protection, and we are struggling. I'm confident we'll win with all of us as allies, but we are struggling to get governments to raise their heads, even the good governments, above their own countries and put in place just a mere 37 billion of a 10 trillion spend for social protection, for health and income in the poorest countries. So when you look at all of these, of the impact, what we would say is, as we look to the future, and we'll come back to this, I know, we need a new social contract. It's not about building back better, although I appreciate the sentiment. It's about building a better future. And that means we need recovery plans built together, as Rajiv said, that actually build resilience. So when the next global shock hits, we are a world that is not fragile with people living on the edge, but a world where planet and people are indeed at the center with economy.
Thank you very much, Sharon. We'll come back to you and know more, a little bit more about the new social contract that you have proposed in your blogs, and would like to hear more. But before we do that, I would like to now go to Sarah from UN Women. And Sarah, my question to you is that, of course, COVID-19 has impacted everyone, but the impact on certain sections of society, let's say women in this particular case, is definitely disproportionate. So if you can highlight those disproportionate impacts on women in Asia Pacific, and what are the potential repercussions for the rights of the women, gender equality issues, the economic empowerment issues for women? If you can unpack this for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Surya. As the other speakers have really highlighted, COVID-19 is exacerbating the inequalities that we already face in the region. And this includes, of course, gender inequalities. And one of the most obvious examples has been around unpaid care work. We know that even before the pandemic, women on average were spending 4 times more time than men on care work at home. And with confinement at home, with lockdown, there is more of this work. Children are out of school, and unfortunately, due to gender norms, this is falling much more on the shoulders of women than on the shoulders of men. Similarly, unfortunately, we see an increase in domestic violence during lockdown and confinement conditions. And this is not only a very serious human rights issue, of course, but it also has impact on women's economic engagement, because typically women who face violence will be missing time from work. And having ongoing health impacts. Economically, we know that women are more likely to work in some of the highly affected sectors, such as garments, such as tourism, such as the service sector, and are also more likely to be self-employed or in very small enterprises where they have less access to social protections and where the businesses are much more vulnerable to the impacts of shocks such as COVID-19. And for women who've migrated, as Panuda had already mentioned, the impacts are even more serious, because there's not only the fact that they're in less formal employment with less protections, but they're also affected by the current travel restrictions as well. Thank you, Surya.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And in addition to women, children are also one of those groups which have been impacted quite significantly, Marco, right? So if you can explain to us in brief that what is the impact UNICEF has seen on rights of children in Asia Pacific. You have the floor. I cannot hear you, Marco.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect. Yes, please go ahead. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Surya. Yes, what I was saying is that indeed something which started as an health crisis might indeed evolve into a child rights crisis. I think children have been affected in the short term by the direct infection of the virus, of course, but also in the mid-term by the immediate socioeconomic impacts of measures that were put in place by the governments in terms of mitigating, in terms of containing the virus. And in the long term, we might lose the gains that we had in terms of sustainable development goals. Let me just give you some facts. I think we might see there are three key dimensions where we see that are posing challenges for the children and children's rights. One is indeed the increase in income poverty. We might have up to 23 million children in this region fall into the poverty. We might see because of the containment measures that have been put in place by the government an increase in the multidimensional poverty, and indeed also in terms of inequalities. Of course, all these three dimensions are all linked together. I just give you a couple of examples. I think children belonging to households which fall into the poverty, of course, might be forced to go for child labor. But also families who fall into the poverty, I think they might limit the choice in terms of nutrition food. So this might lead to increasing malnutrition. And at the same time, we have seen that one of the containment measures that were put in place by the government was the suspension of the schools. So this indeed created a situation where there were a number of kids who could have access to learning from online platforms, but there were also kids who might not have had that kind of opportunities. So this, of course, created also increased disparities across those kids who can afford the online or having television, they can follow online lessons, and kids who might not have. And once they've dropped, they might not go back to school at all. Over to you, Surya.
Thank you so much, Marco. This is very useful. Last but not least, Gam, if I can ask you this question about the indigenous peoples and how COVID-19 has impacted them as a group, as a community. Because we keep on hearing about other sections in society, but sometimes the voices of indigenous peoples don't get highlighted. So how this pandemic has impacted the indigenous peoples in Asia Pacific, and have you done any baseline assessment? Can you share any information with us about this? Thank you. You have the floor.
Yeah, good morning, and thank you for this invitation to speak here and share our experiences. Talking about baseline and data, it is always very difficult in the context of indigenous peoples because most countries don't have. So what we are trying to assess the impact is by doing it by ourselves. And that is by way of preparing a preliminary assessment report that AIPP is trying to do in the 14 countries that we are working. And from this, I can only give you some kind of a patterns and issues that speaks of the intensity of the impact of COVID-19 with reference to indigenous peoples. So for instance, like on the issue of human rights and militarization, we have seen that in Bangladesh, Myanmar in particular, Northeast India, Philippines, these are very hard hit by militarization at this point of COVID-19 because COVID-19 has been used as a cover to conduct military campaigns. And we have seen a number of attacks, cases of rape, torture, extrajudicial killings, and so on. And even Al Jazeera reported in Myanmar that the WHO vehicle also was attacked and a driver was killed. You know? So the intensity of militarization have really increased in some of these areas. So these are the countries that I'm mentioning. The other area that we see a major impact is on the whole issue of livelihood and other kinds of human rights, especially with reference to the migrant workers, refugees, and also the stateless persons, because there are still a large number, a substantial number of indigenous peoples who are still stateless. So they were not able to access the government relief that were provided because they were struggling to prove that, their citizenship with their own governments. And then this kind of migrant issues are reported heavily from a number of countries. For example, in India, there were reports that there were makeshift camps of around more than 23,000. And then families with their children had to walk hundreds of kilometers just to get out of desperation to survive. And many of them also, unfortunately, died after reaching home because of the very desperate situation they had to go through. So migrant workers issues are also heavily reported in Bangladesh and also Thailand, because Thailand is the hub of the Mekong countries for the migrant workers. So I think migrant workers, refugees, and stateless persons were one of the most critically affected as far as indigenous are concerned. Now the migrant workers are returning home with the kind of relaxing of the lockdowns. But then a lot of them are put in quarantine centers and is cramped using the same pond water, using the same toilet facility. So there's no hygiene. And a lot of this number of, reportedly, the number of people who are contacting COVID has increased in the indigenous areas substantially. Before it was much more lesser, but there is an increase in the indigenous areas. So that is a kind of a major health threat that we have to still go through. Other things are like also some of the speakers have shared, a lot of rolling back of rights have occurred. So like the environmental impact assessment rules in India have been relaxed. And also a lot of controversial development programs has been granted in forest areas. So people are not able to go out to protest, demonstrate, or file cases. I know that e-petition, for example, is granted in India, but then this whole digital divide issue, how can the communities be filing the petition and the cases be heard? No? So there are a number of such patterns in terms of the human rights issues that has emerged. But this is not to say that there are no examples of good practices. There were also good practices and we should learn from it. For example, in the northern part of Thailand, the government was quick enough to set up village volunteers and health workers together in all the villages. So they were able to quickly respond to the issue of the basic needs of healthcare and also to be able to access the relief work and so on. And another example that really stands out is in India, in the state of Nagaland, northeast part of India, where the businesses, communities, traditional institutions, governments all came together and worked together in spite of the difficulties and challenges and lack of facilities they were facing, how to respond to this COVID-19, and they were very successful. And I think those are good cases where we should be learning from. And the underlying point here, the last line, is that it is because the government and all the people in these cases has put the trust on the people and also was looking towards empowering the communities, following due processes and the rights and with compassion. No? I think that is the underlying factor that made it successful. Very small cases, but I think these are cases worth to be examined and to learn from. So this is some of the experiences of indigenous peoples.
Thank you, Gan, for Sorry, Surya. Thank you, Gam, for bringing these issues and also sharing some of the best practices in the region. We will come back to you. We'll come back to you in a little while. Kavya, I want to move on to you now. You mentioned that climate change is an urgent issue that the region needs to tackle. What does building back better means in terms of climate change and environmental challenges? And what should government and private sector do in achieving this goal? Over to you.
Thank you very much. So quite simply, it means investments that ensure decarbonization of economies and investments that ensure resilience of people, as many of the speakers have mentioned. Even before COVID-19, our assessment, ESCAP's assessment of progress on SDGs showed a very mixed picture in Asia Pacific of mainly slow progress, but on a number of SDGs, we're moving backwards, and those include SDG 13 on climate action. So this is an unparalleled opportunity to reverse that negative trend and really put the region on track. Just yesterday, we saw some new figures coming out of Bloomberg New Energy Finance and UNEP FI on renewable energy investment, for example. In India and China alone, new green energy capacity in 2019 is down by about 9 or 10% from the previous year, and now it's at the lowest level since 2014. So actually, we're seeing the wrong trajectory in our climate action. In fact, renewable energy as a share of energy production is falling. So all of this means that it's an incredible opportunity to put things right with the billions of dollars that are now flowing out in stimulus packages, redirecting them to investments, of course, in renewable energy, in energy efficiency, in waste management, in green transport, in building resilience in our networks and digital solutions, etc. So in other words, each of these fiscal support packages will need to be measured, and its success will need to be measured by how much it contributes to decarbonization and how much it contributes to building resilience. And we're not seeing that yet. I mean, there are a few good signs. We've seen in the Republic of Korea that the Green New Deal is part of their billion-dollar stimulus package, in which they are actually putting themselves on a trajectory towards zero emissions by 2050. And they're doing that by investing those funds in renewable energy. They're doing that by introducing the carbon tax, by phasing out coal, etc. But they're also doing that by establishing a regional energy transition center to support workers as they move to jobs in more sustainable sectors. So the just transition. And we need to see much more of this. In a way, we need to see conditionality for businesses that are receiving public funds. We're seeing it in other countries. We see it in France, for example, public money that is being invested in rescuing airlines or car manufacturers is also being used to push those same businesses in the right direction to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And we need to see exactly the same in Asia Pacific, with our businesses adopting really a GHG reduction targets, science-based GHG reduction targets, as is being actually advocated by our own ESCAP Sustainable Business Network. So those are some of the ways that we can nudge the businesses in the right direction with the billions that are now flowing out.
Thank you, Kavya. I would want to now move on to Valerie. Valerie, in many ways, the pandemic is preparing governments, it's preparing the businesses for potential future crises. What lessons do you think we can learn from the current pandemic to prepare better for future crises? Thank you.
Thank you, Harpreet. Of course, all of us were taken by such surprise by the magnitude of this pandemic, and many institutions, including UNDP, are focusing on a structured response built around preparing, responding to, and recovering from the crisis. There's an additional crucial effort that will require much of our time and resources in the future, and of course, that's on prevention. Prevention should be our priority when it comes to future health crises, as well as potential future disasters that originate from climate change in particular. The risks associated with these crises are both economic and social. According to the Asian Development Bank, If greenhouse gas emissions are not reduced substantially, climate change impacts could result in damages and losses that will reduce Southeast Asia's GDP by up to 11%. A post-pandemic world shall be guided or should be guided by a new social contract focused on reduced inequalities, strengthened mechanisms to enhance resilience to shocks. The pandemic has visibly exposed all of the vulnerabilities and inadequacies inherent in current systems and their enormous social and economic costs. Scientists tell us that it could be 1 year or more before a vaccine for COVID-19 is developed, but the vaccine against future disasters and the worst climate change scenarios already exists. It's called Living More Sustainably, an effort that requires action from each one of us and a responsibility of the business sector to fully and consistently embrace sustainable business practices and profit alongside the impact of the business operations on people. Bold and courageous action is needed and encouraged. The recent announcement by the European Commission to introduce rules for mandatory corporate environmental and human rights due diligence is highly commendable and will set standards to be followed by companies with large parts of their supply chain management in Asia and the Pacific region. We also look favorably at the steps taken by some countries in Asia Pacific region to integrate human rights and environmental actions to operate more sustainably. The chapter on environmental rights in the Thailand National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights is a good example of an integrated approach to sustainability standards. We'll be promoting these good practices across Asia and the Pacific, and we'll do so by joining forces with many actors, including many of the panelists and their organizations here and in and outside the UN family, that share a common agenda and a more sustainable future. We're very pleased to see that so many participants are signed up for this week-long event, and we look forward to listening and engaging. Our common message today is the one shared by the UN Secretary General to call for global concerted action for all of us as we're all in this together. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Valerie. I'm going to move on to Shamini now. Shamini, how do you think has the pandemic affected the role of civil society organizations? What implications does this have for the agency's funding on business and human rights work in Asia and the Pacific? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Harpreet. As we heard from a couple of the earlier speakers, several governments in the region are using the pandemic as a pretext to infringe on rights. From the freedom of expression, assembly, association, to privacy, to the right to food and livelihood. It has been strenuous work for CSOs to not only support human rights defenders impacted by the crisis, but to also document violations due to restriction of movements. This is because the already scarce protection and remedies previously available are now even more difficult to access. Further, emergency decrees are misused to criminalize free speech, chilling free expression and the vital work of CSOs and defenders. Calling out on abusive governments is more important than ever, especially in this challenging time. We are still in the process of adjusting to this pandemic era, conscious that while we do so, violations continue, including the ones perpetrated by businesses. Online work is becoming a part of our daily operations as we see today, but we risk to operate in a privileged bubble, while there are local groups and grassroots communities that do not have access to the appropriate technology, tools, and connection. Appropriate allocation of funds are needed for this, as addressing business and human rights issues in the region requires solid and genuine collaboration with grassroots groups and local communities. What is also needed is flexibility from funding agencies. Conditions are changing rapidly, and so are the needs of CSOs, defenders, and community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shamini. And before I now move on to Panuda and ask her views about the solutions from the ILO's perspective, I would also make a request to all the panelists. At the bottom of your screen, you will see the Q&A section, and there are a lot of questions coming. Some questions are specific to particular panelists. And Harpreet and I will pick up some questions and we'll ask those questions towards the end of this session. But there may not be enough time to take too many questions. So if you are free and you are able to answer any questions, please feel free to do so. Thank you with that. So Panuda, if I may ask you now, in terms of the better normal that the ILO regional director talked about in the video, what are the key elements that you see in terms of managing the world of work? Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you, Surya. As countries are now moving into the recovery phase of the pandemic response, greater attention should be paid to strengthen employment policies, to support sustainable enterprises, and to support workers, along with strong labor market institutions. Particularly focus is important is on health and safety. A safe return to workplaces is critical and central to work on. Clearly, there is a need to enhance social protection. Countries should really work towards universal coverage of social protection systems. And also important is to make sure that all group of people in the society, all group of workers are covered by social protection systems. I must say that we take note that during this crisis, many countries have quickly expanded their social protection coverage in a number of social protection programs and social assistance programs. I think those are very positive, but they have to go beyond the quick response. They have to be sustained and they have to be really built up for more comprehensive towards universal coverage towards the end. So instead of thinking about the business as usual or the old normal that we already recognize that is really has left so many people, workers behind, and also as Sharon said, it has increased inequality. We should turn this into an opportunity to build a better normal. And I think that is clearly important is really to focus the support to the vulnerable first, and that is really important priority. We think that it's very important to look into building the future of work that tackles inequalities and injustice. So there must be a global human-centered response to work together at the global level. A response must be well coordinated. Of course, they also have to be tailored to specific needs, but the coverage had to be really, the collaboration has to be at the global scale. This cannot be done by any particular country alone. And we think that international labor standards must be guiding principles and framework for policy and interventions at all levels. The ILO has been working with tripartite constituents, government, employers, and workers on 4 policy agenda for response to the crisis and also the recovery. The first pillar is around stimulating the economy and employment. The second pillar is supporting enterprises, jobs, and incomes. The third pillar is protecting workers. The fourth pillar is relying on social dialogue for solutions. And these are very important policy agendas that we look forward to enhance our collaboration with our tripartite constituents, but also with other stakeholders. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Panuda. And now if I may move to Rajiv. Several companies, Rajiv, have responded in a commendable way to deal with this unprecedented crisis. And perhaps Mahindra is one of those companies. So as a leader in this field, how can you inspire other businesses and other SMEs to respond to this crisis? And some of the issues are about social injustice, inequality. So what role businesses can play going forward in creating a more inclusive better, equal, and sustainable world? You have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Surya. So I would say three big things. Number one, to look upon this situation not through the eyes of being a victim and being helpless and blaming others, but trying to see if there are opportunities, and I'll expand on that. The second one is remaining rooted in your purpose and values as you take decisions, where you have to balance the short term and the longer term, but at all times, making sure that you're giving hope and dealing with your stakeholders with empathy. And the third one is sharing the pain as you go around creating shared value. So let me quickly talk about opportunity and not being a victim. Can we use this opportunity to relook at our own processes so that we can be more efficient and more effective? Can we reinvent products, services, processes, indeed business models? And can we reignite ourselves? Can we raise our aspirations so that when the tide is in our favor, we can catch the tide and create value and create tomorrow? In all of this, we need to be completely rooted to our purpose and to our values. Let me just give you an example. So you mentioned Mahindra. In Mahindra, written and unwritten rule is that when we are looking at cost, the last cost that we want to touch is removing people from jobs, right? So that becomes a value. And so we will look at every possibility. We may even take cuts, all of us, and the people at the top will take bigger cuts so that the pain is shared and so that we are creating shared value. And in all of this, it is about dialogue. It is about talking. It is about co-creating. It is about trying to find win-lose. It is about trying to balance the immediate needs with the future. But it is about partnership. It is about hope. It is about creating tomorrow. And it is not about being a victim above all, but trying to see opportunity. This is my generic answer. One can get into specifics if one had the time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rajiv. That's very useful. And you provided some concrete examples how this can be done. So Sharon, if I may ask you now, you mentioned earlier about this new social contract that you have articulated in your blog as well. You have spoken about it. So how do we put this into practice so that we create a better world for workers, for society, and the planet? And what roles do you see for the trade unions globally, as well as in Asia Pacific, in achieving this goal? You have the floor.
So we won't build a recovery with a resilience base if we don't actually build trust. And the social contract was broken in the 80s by a hyper-globalization that was based on global trade with dehumanizing supply chains, with a breakdown in the business model. We need to rebuild that. But indeed, business is central to this. And I think Rajiv's call for dialogue is at the heart. The ILO last year negotiated a centenary declaration, and a lot of the building blocks of a new social contract are indeed there. We must have responsible business conduct. We must have mandated due diligence and an end to the dehumanization of a business world, particularly for our workers in supply chains in the Asia Pacific. And as we see them collapse through this crisis, while we're working with many employers, it really does drive a stark divide between those who want to change and those who don't. We cannot have a global labor force that is 60% informal, because there's no responsibility there for the employment relationship. There's no labor protection floor with rights, occupational health and safety, minimum living wages, and of course, maximum hours of work. That must underpin all work now, and it will take political will. We also need, of course, labour market regulation for this floor, and that with universal social protection is central to a new contract, a new social contract that allows us to work for recovery, that can build resilience. And it must also include, of course, jobs and job creation. We know that if we invest in enabling green infrastructure, if we invest in industry policy, if we invest in care and the repair of ecosystems, we can create jobs. And I thought Kevin was indeed right there with those prescriptions about at building a convergence between climate and employment, because otherwise we just risk people and the planet. We must have income protection. If we don't actually have social protection that is about health and income, then again, the 70% of people who miss out now will miss out next time. And that's just going to keep going with vicious cycles of shocks. We have to have, this has shown how we have to have occupational health and safety. Public health, yes, but occupational health and safety at the heart of a rights base. And of course, we can never again see our health and education systems underfunded. This is critical, and the world is 3 times richer in just the last 20 years, yet we're failing to reduce inequality, to do these things and to provide a rights base or the universal social protection we need. But we have to do this with just transitions for climate and for technology if we want an inclusive world and if we want to actually prevent the extinction of the human race. As I said, we need responsible business conduct with mandated due diligence for human rights and environmental standards. The time is now. We want the treaty, of course, but we also want governments to do as the EU has promised and mandate due diligence. Let's change the face of the way business, unions, civil society, but mostly workers and their communities interact. And we must have government accountability. We have to get beyond GDP. People want trust in democracy. And we've seen the breakdown in that trust. If they don't actually trust that that they can see themselves there, that their privacy rights, their security is indeed in the hands of those they elect. I want to finish on saying this requires financing. And I was privileged to be part of the UN discussion on financing the SDGs last week, and we'll work with the working groups. We need an approach to long-termism, patient capital we call it. Workers have $37 trillion of their pension funds invested in the global economy, and we want it to be invested in jobs and resilience. And also, of course, we want patient debt. If we learned anything from the 2008-2009 crisis, and for my sins, I've been at every G20 meeting since 2008, when the world leaders, at least the richest countries, not inclusive, of course, but said, we are going to actually make things, do things differently. Well, we didn't learn the lesson of speculative capital. So now we need to get the promises of taxation right, an end to tax havens. We need a new tax on digital tax. We need probably to think about a wealth tax. How can you have so many billionaires and now potentially the first trillionaire in an unregulated business like Amazon with Jeff Bezos, and pretend that we don't need a wealth tax and these people should give back? So there's a lot of financing options, but we need to change to a patient debt approach with investment where people can pay back and leverage fiscal consolidation of growth based on universal social protection and a solidarity fund for the poorest countries to make that happen, and jobs, jobs and jobs. I just finished by a little advertisement. On June 24th, the ITUC, with many business leaders, many governments in support, will have an international day of action called Kapow, Climate and Employment Proof Our Workplace. There'll be conversations in workplaces all around the world. We invite you all to join because that's the challenge of recovery. Can we build secure jobs, secure futures with a climate where people can actually be confident their communities, their environment are secure, and as a foundation for business that is indeed committed to the same values that we all are, a rights-based future that's inclusive for everybody.
Thanks, Sharon. Sarah, I'm going to come back to you now, basically also to ask about how do you think in states as well as businesses ensure that women are essential contributors to economic recovery? Over to you, Sarah.
I think Harpreet, Sarah dropped out with internet issues in Cambodia. I'm happy to jump in from a women's perspective, or do you want to pass to the next speaker and we wait for Sarah coming back? Either way is fine for me.
Sure, let's just wait for Sarah, and I can ask the next question to Marco, particularly around children. Marco, if I may ask, what concerted actions governments and businesses take to address adverse impacts on children? For example, how could businesses use the children's rights and business principle during emergency situations like COVID-19? And if I may ask you to be very brief with your answer, we're running a little behind, and we would like to keep some time for the question and answers from this floor. Thank you.
Indeed, Harpreet. I think, as I was saying before, I think we see three key dimensions that are really affecting, or might be affecting the children's rights. One is the overall vulnerability to poverty, the multidimensional poverty, and then the disparities. Within a scenario where we see the economy slowing down, services have been interrupted, and the fiscal space at the international, regional, global level shrinking. So indeed, this requires a distillation of key interventions and policy options, which will help, can help, for instance, in the area of health, in the area of social services, bringing services closer to the people, to the children, and by saying closer, that doesn't mean physically closer. We have seen, for instance, as the other speakers were mentioning, how can we make sure that the public expenditures or the financing can really be helpful for supporting children who might drop out of schools. How do we make sure that the social protection, we can actually modernize the social protection system, which as the previous speakers also were mentioning, has been proved to be very efficient and effective in addressing the immediate and medium-term impacts of the situation for children. I think this requires a partnership indeed between the public and private. I think service providers are also private sector providers. So I think it's important that there is a dialogue in making sure that again, interventions are very cost efficient and relevant to the most vulnerable. I think, for instance, we have seen that during this time of crisis, many companies have been implementing flexible working arrangement. And so how can we make sure that this will become more and more something that the companies will support in order to provide parents an opportunity to take care of the kids when the kids are out of school or they cannot attend school because of the closure. So I think there is, or for instance, how can we make sure that companies and private sectors can ensure paid leave for parents. Companies, in terms of, we have been discussing a little bit about the digital divide, but beyond digital, we have seen also that some companies, through the mobile network operators, can actually be very useful in reaching out those kids who eventually potentially could not really have access to e-learning or online courses. Over to you, Harpreet.
Thanks, Marco. I'm going to move on to GAM. GAM, we've seen a lot of questions on the Q&A, but then also it's been referred by other panelists, the impacts that, that the industrial projects have on the restricted areas. And, to revive the economy, some governments are easing rules, regulations to set up industrial projects in the restricted areas, many of which are homes to indigenous peoples. What will be your recommendations to ensure indigenous people do not get caught up in the development-induced displacement and related impacts on their rights? Over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harpreet. As you know, this is a big question, but let me try to be concise, focusing on a small area. Sure. I think what the pandemic has brought out very clearly is the importance of the role of government. And this is something to be underlined and we should not forget. And mainly, I think the government cannot give up on the aspects of healthcare, food production and distribution. And we reference indigenous peoples very particularly on the issue of non-timber forest products. That's both for daily survival as well as of marketing and getting the cash income. The other aspect is education. We know that we expected that many indigenous people are going to be experiencing dropouts, and also many are still are already not able to attend the online classes that is going on. So the aspect of also strengthening the communication, this is very essential as the part on the role of the government. Now, when it comes to businesses, I think the important issue that should be stressed is the role of the government to facilitate collaboration between the government, businesses, and the communities. And the aspect that there are no legal frameworks in domestic law and all this kind of things should not become the excuse, because we know what is the right thing to do. And there's so many other international frameworks available to see what is the way to go about, what is the yardstick for us to measure whether we are doing things correctly and so on. And therefore, in this partnership, government and businesses must respect and move towards community empowerment and decentralization. Now, why I'm saying this is that both in the time of COVID-19, it is the communities who were more empowered and who had some sort of self-governance and land rights were able to perform far more better than those areas where there were no land rights. Now, just let me give you one example just to make it concrete. For example, in Northeast India, there are 8 states predominantly by indigenous, inhabited by indigenous groups. And if you see the statistics of the rate of education, these 8 states are doing very well. Rather, indigenous groups are actually performing better than the national averages. And out of these 8 states, 5 of them are in the top list of the, out of the 10 top states in India. But if you compare now to the central India, where there's heavy industrialization and no land rights, you see that there is a huge gap between the non-indigenous groups and the indigenous groups. The question is, why is this happening? You know, the pointer is very clear that where communities are more empowered and they have more land rights and so on, are able to perform much better because they're empowered and they're trusted by the system. You know? So the promises of jobs and income and so on alone will not be the way to go about, but must look at the systemic issues that the government must address in this partnership that will be facilitated. I think that is very important, and that is the point that I would like to really stress in terms of moving forward. And we have seen this both in the pandemic time, that the communities who are empowered and trusted have performed much better, and that is the lesson. And this is also with reference to the goal 16 of the SDG. You know, that should become the focus when it comes to the communities and indigenous peoples in particular. So I will end there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cam. And I see Sarah is back online. Sarah, if you can respond on how do you think states and businesses can ensure that women are essential contributors to the economic recovery?
Thank you so much, Harpreet, and I'm glad to be back. So as I mentioned before, we understand already that the economy can benefit hugely from closing the gender gap, and this really has to be seen as an opportunity to do that. So maybe just to highlight a few of the key and concrete things that, first of all, perhaps businesses can do. It can be very important, as we've heard from some of the panelists here, for businesses to actually publicly commit to principles. So, for example, in this case, taking a gender responsive stance and ensuring women are included in the leadership of the economic recovery and are visibly there. They can support, of course, their direct employees with flexible working arrangements and support for the care commitments that both women and men ideally have. And also look at the indirect employees that they have in their value chains. And there are some concrete examples actually in this region of companies who have continued to support some of those people in their value chain during this COVID crisis and taken that responsibility. And another important area would be upskilling, especially considering the gender digital divide. It's clear now that the digital skills are going to be more important than ever. Obviously, these private sector actions and responsibilities are very important, but they have to happen within a context of policy as well. So some of the key things that we would really like governments to look at in the economic recovery packages are investing in the sectors where women are working, investing in childcare, quality childcare that people can afford, really supporting some of the medium, micro and small enterprises, particularly including women-owned informal businesses, which we know may often be excluded from some of the stimulus packages that are being proposed. And also trying to expand social protection, including for women migrant workers and women in informal sectors. And also, as I mentioned earlier, that gender-based violence is unfortunately a reality for many women during this pandemic. I think this is also an opportunity for us to really identify services on GBV as a priority and as part of the essential package of social services as we move forward. Sure. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah. And now, thank you very much, the panelists here. And I would now like to, we would like to include a message from His Excellencies, Mr. Per Arberger, the Ambassador for Sustainable Business, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Government of Sweden. He couldn't be personally online because of the time zone, but we do have a message from him. Irene, if you could play the video, please. Thank you.
Let me express my appreciation to the organizers of the Responsible Business and Human Rights Forum. This conference could not have been more timely or more important. COVID-19 is a global health, economic and social crisis. The effects will be felt for years to come. The pandemic is a test of societies, of governments, of communities and of companies. This is not the time for isolation. International cooperation is needed to manage the crisis, to tackle the health emergency, but also to focus on the social impacts and the economic recovery. The pandemic reinforces the trend of backsliding democracy and weakened respect for human rights. It hits hard on already marginalized groups. Sweden is working hard to make sure that human rights, democracy, and the rule of law are at the heart of the global response to the pandemic, in the short as well as in the long term. The Swedish government has launched a platform for international sustainable business with a clear expectation on Swedish companies to act responsibly by working for human rights, gender equality, good working conditions, the environment, climate, and not least to combat corruption. This is crucial when we together build back better and stronger after the pandemic. With core support from Sweden and others, UNDP has been able to rapidly support governments in the response. Through Sweden's Regional Development Cooperation Strategy for Asia and the Pacific, we work with various partners in the region to support and promote human rights, gender equality, environment, climate in tackling the regional challenges. We are delighted to see the interest and participation from stakeholders in our partnership with UNDP on the Business and Human Rights Asia program. This will promote the capacity as well as the strong ownership of our partner countries and the region in moving the business and human rights process forward.
All right, so I would like to thank the ambassador for his message. We really appreciate that. Now we just have about 5 minutes to conclude the session, and ideally would have liked to have more time for taking up questions from the virtual floor, but unfortunately we do not have time. But I will still try to pick up a couple of questions very quickly. One question, and perhaps this is more suitable for ILO. So Panuda, if you can respond to that. I will read 2 or 3 questions, and then I will ask each one of you to respond in 1 minute each maximum. My apologies, but time is very short. So the question for ILO perhaps is that as we are seeing this race to the bottom about labor laws being relaxed to ensure that there is a better economic recovery, So how do you respond to this? So do we see the workers' rights and the trade unions' rights getting diluted? Perhaps you can answer that question, Panuda, later on. There is a question, perhaps, Sharon, you may look at this question. There's a question about that there is this initiative to have the international convention to have mandatory due diligence in human rights. So if you would like to reflect on this, that when this could become a reality. And there is kind of an open question, and I will invite anyone who would like to volunteer this, that is there any evidence that responsible businesses have weathered the crisis better? So I will start with Panuda now. 1 minute, please. You have the floor, Panuda. And then Sharon after this. Please unmute yours. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. I think Sharon mentioned the importance of the legal framework as we go forward towards the sustainable solutions across the board. I think the labor law and the legal framework is clearly central. And at the country level, the process, the tripartite consultation, the way the consultation take place, the ILO supports this consultation process across the board to make sure that all important issues related to the world of work are brought to the table. Should there be a lack of the legal framework, I think it's very important that that kind of issues are brought to the discussion and find solutions in the consultation among the tripartite constituents, the governments, the employers, and the workers. And here, I'd like to emphasize the importance of international labor standards because they have been approved at the global level in the tripartite manner. Therefore, they provide consensus-based solutions. So any solutions at the country level have to benefit and make use of the principles and the guidance of the international labor standards so that they can really lead to the sustainable solutions in the long run. Thank you.
Thank you, Panuda. Sharon, if you would like to answer the question about mandatory human rights due diligence and what should happen, domestic or international treaty, or what is the way to go about it?
Well, the UN treaty is critical, and we urge all governments to join with business, civil society, trade unions in getting this done. Business and human rights with due diligence, with grievance and with remedy, the pillars at the core, is a way to place a global framework for responsible business conduct and allow us to genuinely put people and the planet in place. But we need more than that. The EU made the promise, Commissioner Reynaerts, a couple of, actually last month, that the EU would now legislate for due diligence, a directive for due diligence. We will support that. We want every country to mandate due diligence. We cannot any longer build a world economy on the basis of exploitation and human rights abuse. So many businesses working with us in support of this, and we would ask everybody to do just that. And as the ILO regional director says, we need ultimately to have the kind of global standard under the labour floor that is inclusive of a labour rights, a labour protection floor, social protection, just transitions for climate and environment, and a transformative agenda for women with due diligence at the core. So the OECD started the game. Their general due diligence guidance is a base for everybody. Let's make it happen.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Now, anyone else would like to?
Yes,
Rajiv, I see Raj. Okay,
yeah,
yes.
Yeah, okay.
Please go ahead.
So, Surya, I want to respond to the question, is there any evidence to show that responsible businesses have weathered the crisis better?
Yeah.
So I think we are, the time period is too short, so we don't have evidence. But I think the question itself needs to be questioned. I don't think it's a choice. Should we be responsible or should we be irresponsible? Of course, we have to be responsible. We have to be responsible not only to profit, but to people and planet. And the three have to go together. And there is a huge amount of logic and there's a huge amount of evidence pre-COVID-19 that shows that that is the way forward. And I'm 100% sure that it will be so going forward. So I don't think it's a question. It's a commitment. It's about a purpose, and it's about values. And these are not conditional on what kind of results come. That was my response.
Thank you so much, Rajiv. And I think perhaps this is a good way to end this opening plenary, because this is coming from a business and you're talking about an unconditional, unqualified commitment that companies should be making to respect human rights. Basically, if I reframe your response, these are the values that the businesses should embody. With this, both Harpreet and I would like to thank all the panelists, and especially Sharon. She is waking up early in the morning in Europe, I believe. So I really appreciate all of you finding time from your busy schedule to join with us. I would also like to thank all the participants who have been listening from different parts of the world. Thank you very much, and I hope you will enjoy the rest of the forum as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.